What's up, everybody? Welcome back. The Natty Light is back. This is the one thing that my wife thought was funny from any of my previous videos, and so she purchased it again and has subjected us all to another round of Natty Lights. The last air-cooled Sportster rolled off the assembly line in 2022, and since that point in time, I've seen basically nothing but comments saying that it should be brought back. This ranges from videos that we shoot at the dealership about the new Revax Sportsters to discussions I see on other YouTube channels about why the motor company isn't doing as well as it could be doing. The common theme that you see in a lot of those comment sections is this belief that the air-cooled Sportster should be brought back, that it was a mistake to get rid of it. And while I don't fundamentally agree with a lot of the reasons and justifications that people think it should be brought back, I actually do think it was a mistake to get rid of the air-cooled Sportster. But I'm making this video today because when I spent a lot of time thinking about the air-cooled Sportster and its demise, I ultimately came to the conclusion that I probably would have made the same mistake as the motor company, that I would have fumbled this ball too. And it's for that reason I think it's kind of an interesting video, because we can kind of explore why the motor company did what they did, and it's going to help us understand some of the other decisions they made in the past, but also decisions that they might make in the future. I think the place that maybe makes the most sense to start is to actually explore why I'm making a video about a model or a family of models that was killed 3 years ago, right? Like, why are we talking about this now? And why does it keep coming up in comment sections of videos that are basically unrelated to the Sportster? So there are some widely held sentiments in the Harley Davidson community that I think that the death of the Evo Sporty helps to prop up. And these sentiments range from the fact that Harley Davidson doesn't care about its core customers anymore, to Harley Davidson has abandoned producing affordable bikes for its customers, to the identity of the bikes has changed. And while I don't agree with those sentiments, I do understand how the death of the Evo Sporty could be used to support those arguments. The Evo Sporties had the same engine platform since the 80s, which kind of means that not only did they represent the classic character of Harley Davidson, that they actually helped to build what people's perception of Harley Davidson is. It was a lot of people's first experience with the motor company, and for a lot of riders, it represents kind of that quintessential ideal. It's air-cooled, 45 degree, it's got that classic sound that people expect from a Harley Davidson. But furthermore, and I think something that gets probably overlooked by a lot of people, is that the fit and finish of those bikes was extremely high quality. There are very few bikes that are built to the quality of an air-cooled Sporty, which I think, as we're going to talk about later, is part of what made their demise somewhat inevitable. They really do feel like heirlooms that you can pass down. Despite a lot of their more technical deficiencies, they really do embody the character and quality of a Harley Davidson better than a lot of other bikes within the lineup. And because of how long it was made and how well it represented the brand's character, it became a core product. And so it no longer being produced just inherently meant to some customers that Harley had made a mistake, that they had lost their way. So very clearly, I can understand how someone would think that the death of the air-cooled Sporty is representative of Harley Davidson either not caring too much about their core customer base and or losing its identity, because how could you get rid of the air-cooled Sporty when it is such a perfect encapsulation of both of those things, what your customer wants and what your brand represents? But I think it also hits another common sentiment that's popular in the online Harley Davidson community right now, which is that Harley Davidson no longer is concerned with offering an affordable Harley Davidson experience. The air-cooled Sporty was pretty much the only way to get into the brand for under $10,000 brand new, and that's a price point that I think is relatively affordable for most people. It translates to a payment of roughly $200 or less a month, depending on how much you put down. And in many cases, it's in that price point area where some people can afford to just pay cash for it. Well, I have some specific rebuttals to that, namely that you can still get a 979 Nightster for less than 10,000 bucks. The reality is that that doesn't offer the exact same experience that the air-cooled Sporty offered. And so I can understand why people don't think that that's a like-for-like comparison, because the 975 is by design a very, very different product. And I don't think there's really any way to sugarcoat it. The new 975, yeah, it's lighter, yeah, it's faster, but the fit and finish just isn't as nice. There's more plastic on it. I think that customers have noticed. But this video really isn't about the new 975. It's about why people are still talking about the air-cooled Sporty being killed. And obviously, people are talking about it because it was a beloved classic that was one of the most affordable ways to enter the brand, and it was around for a really, really long time. So it was a really known quantity that people saw as a core product. But that obviously begs the question of why did Harley kill it off? Okay, so you have something that your customers really, really like, that they're presumably buying in decent enough quantities, that you've made for a long time. So it's obviously not like a resource drain in terms of R&D. So why would you kill it off if you're the motor company? You could say what we talked about before, that Harley is abandoning its core customers and they don't care about having something in the sub $10,000 price point. I don't really buy that. I think Harley Davidson still wants to sell you bikes, and they think if they have a product that's doing well and making them money, they're going to continue to make it because they're a business and that's what businesses do. So I don't find those arguments to be compelling reasons as to why the Sporty was killed off. But let's go ahead and just start with some basic facts. You're not going to get it past Euro 5 regulations without a pretty significant update. And another fact that is kind of indisputable is that it was being left behind by its nearest rivals when it came to specs. Read any review of a Sporty after like 2016, 2017, and they're going to talk about how the Indian offers more power from its liquid cooled motor and how you can get a little bit better value from Honda if you go with their new Rebel. And Harley isn't immune to that kind of criticism. They're not immune to that kind of competition. They have to be competitive on specs with their nearest rivals. And the reality is, if you look at Harley Davidson's offerings to their what they would perceive as direct competitors, a Nightster to a Scout, a Lowrider S to, what do they call it? The Sport Chief, I think, a Road Glide to a Challenger. The specs are not that far off. Harley's going to win some of those specs and Indian's going to win some of those specs. But I think that Harley looked at the air-cooled Sporty and saw that it was not trading blows with anyone, really. It was mostly just deficient to its competitors in almost every category on the spec sheets. Like, I just want to remind everybody that it was like a 40-something horsepower bike when it came to the 883, and it had a 5-speed transmission, and it weighed nearly 600 pounds. Sorry, my cat decided he wanted to be in the shot right now. So those are some simple facts that are worth considering, right? The Sporty was going to be dead in Europe unless they did a pretty big update to it, right? We're talking redesigning the engine. And also, it was lacking in terms of specs compared to its competitors. So while those are facts, there's also some things that are a little bit more subjective that I think are important to point out. First, I don't think the Evo Sportster was making Harley Davidson very much money. I think if you look at the quality and the fit and finish of that bike, there's basically nothing at that price point that's being sold by any manufacturer, let alone Harley. And I think the only thing keeping it profitable was the fact that it had remained largely, in many ways, unchanged for about a decade, right? The last major update to the bikes was like in 2016, and they got revised suspension and some other things like that. Before that, you had the update where they became rubber mounted. The transmissions have been updated over the years, but the core architecture, a lot of it had been largely unchanged, meaning the R&D for the bike, the tooling for the bike had been paid for long ago. And so if you didn't have to update it, you could still make it profitably. It's kind of like the Gixxer 600 of the cruiser world. So while it probably was an extremely expensive bike to manufacture in terms of like its individual parts, it wasn't trying to recoup any R&D, and so that meant that they could keep making a profit. But as we talked about, it was going to need an update for Europe. I think that the used market for the Sporties is also a factor that needs to be talked about here. I think it was just kind of flushed. I think that like they've made so many Sporties over such a long period of time that very few people were choosing to go new by the end of its life cycle, right? Like they were mostly just buying a very lightly used bike for thousands of dollars less, because the reality is that a lot of the spec deficiencies that we talked about earlier, the 5-speed transmission and the 44 horsepower, meant that 6 months, a year into ownership, guys were back in the dealership trading them in. And so you had all of these really lightly used bikes with, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 miles on them that were several $1,000s cheaper, because you have to price them that way in order to sell them versus a new one. And so people just bought used ones. They rode around on them for a year and then traded them in for something that was a little more highway capable. And I also just think that there's not as much truth to some of the sentiments that we talked about before, right? We talked about how this was such a core product for people because it was air cooled, because it sounded a certain way. But the reality is that I think that the Scout is one of the most successful products that Indian has in its lineup. And it's liquid cooled and sounds nothing like a Sportster. So I think that Harley looked at bikes like the Sportster and the Rebel and said, hey, I think we can be successful with a liquid cooled motor, and that'll get us competitive on specs. I think they saw everyone else being praised for these higher performance models that had less classic cruiser motor in them. Hey, I want some of that praise too. I want some of that respect from those motor journalists who are going to promote my product instead of getting bashed every time we give them a Sportster because it's got outdated tech. So I think the death of the Sportster, right? If we're analyzing why Harley got rid of that model and that family of bikes, it's kind of 1,000 cuts. It's a really popular bike in Europe, but you're not going to be able to sell it there because of environmental regulation. It's getting absolutely slaughtered on specs. And while a lot of customers don't care, it's definitely not getting itself any good press with, motorcycle.com and whatnot. 3, they see other brands being successful with a liquid cooled motor and say, okay, well, I guess maybe we can get away with it too. And then 4, it's really expensive to manufacture that bike. And so it's not, I don't think, even a very profitable bike. And I think Harley was hoping that everyone who bought one would just trade it in and they would make money on the second time. But the reality is that they weren't making a killing on it. So now that we've talked about the reasons that Harley discontinued the air-cooled Sportster, I think it's time to talk about what they could do to replace it, right? What options did they have going forward once they decided to discontinue the Evo Sporty? So I think the first hypothetical strategy is probably the boldest one. So I'm gonna call it that. I'm gonna call it the bold strategy, and it is to redesign the Evo power plant with, I don't know, 4 valve heads or oil cooling setup that lets them run higher compression, or I don't know, something that gets that air-cooled motor past emissions in Europe. I can't stress how important the Sporty lineup is to the European market. It's probably one of the main reasons the Sportster was around as long as it was, because that was so crucial to that market. Old Sporty is not going to meet the regulations with the Evo motor, so we design a new air-cooled lightweight motor for the Sportster going forward. Now, this is the bold strategy because it's really expensive, because engines are the most expensive component to develop for the bike, and you're gonna have to invest in all new tooling for this engine. You're gonna have to invest in, obviously, all the R&D to design it. If you're gonna go to the trouble of designing a new motor, you might as well design a new transmission for it so you have a 6-speed instead of that same old 5-speed. Now we're talking about maybe changing the engine mounts, and so now we're talking maybe a new frame, new suspension, new electronics. We're talking about a complete redesign, really, if we're being honest. And ultimately, I really like this option. We're going to talk about why I think Harley didn't go with this option, but I think it's awesome. Like I like the idea of a air-cooled option below the new Softails that customers could get into at a lower price. So if I like this option, why didn't Harley go with it? There must be some reasons Harley chose not to go in that direction. And I think, unfortunately, it all comes down to money. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I think the only thing that kept the air-cooled Sporty from being completely horrifically non-profitable, like I'm talking about like them losing thousands of dollars on every single one, was the fact that it had no R&D costs associated with it. Because if you take a step back and you just ask this question, what about the Sportster is less expensive for Harley to make than the new Softails, right? Material costs, maybe, right? It's 70 pounds lighter. I mean, what's the average price of aluminum and steel, right? We're talking probably what, maybe $1 per pound. Okay, so you save $100 on material costs. But otherwise, it's basically just as complicated to manufacture. It's just as high quality, and maybe you save some money on individual components, like you're not running dual disc brakes on very many Sporties. But honestly, what's going to make an air-cooled Sportster less expensive to manufacture than a new Street Bob? I can't really think of anything. And so if you go to the trouble of redesigning a Sportster and you give it a 6-speed and you give it a new Euro 5 compliant motor and you invest all that money, well, now it has to pay for all of that out of its profits. It's not just costs that were incurred by the motor company back in 1986 when the bike came out, or the incremental costs that were incurred when the updates and new models were designed for the old Evo Sporty. It's now a whole new model that has to recoup all of its R&D. And I just don't see how it's any less expensive to manufacture it. It's going to be just as expensive to manufacture as a street bob. Maybe someone in the comment section knows a lot more about manufacturing than me and can write, you know, a whole video, maybe hopefully responding to this, about how the air-cooled Sporty, this hypothetical one that gets redesigned to pass Euro 5, would be significantly cheaper to build than the current M8 Softails. But I honestly can't think of the ways in which it would be dramatically cheaper. Not thousands and thousands of dollars cheaper, that's for sure. So unfortunately, I think that kind of kills the bold strategy right out of the gate. The reality is that it costs roughly the same amount to make various types of gas tanks. If you're making them out of steel and you're making them to the same quality, you still have to pay Nissan or Brembo for the brakes. You still have to pay Showa for the suspension. And sure, you can spec slightly lower versions of all those things and maybe make the bike $1,000 less expensive than a street bob, but you're probably better off figuring out a way to make the street bob $13.99 than you are to design a whole new air-cooled Sportster setup that is $12.99, right? $1,000 less than the current Softails. I just think that mathematically, it just doesn't pan out, especially when you then factor in that instead of just trying to figure out a way to make a slightly less expensive Softail, you're now running 2 assembly lines and 2 part networks, right? For all of the models that are based upon this. And you're having to run just more supply chains, and it just suddenly makes it a lot less cost effective. So I think that the bold strategy, as much as I would love the idea of a Euro 5 compliant, lighter, air-cooled option than the Softails, I just don't think it makes sense financially. So the second option is to keep it like the Gixxer 600, which has basically been unchanged since 2013 and is only available in the markets where it still passes emissions. So you could have done that with the air-cooled 883 and 1200. You could have kept making them for the US market and whatever other markets they were still legal in, and that's it. They're probably not going to lose you too much money because there's not a bunch of R&D that you have to recoup because you've been making the bike forever, and you just keep going forward with that. I don't personally think this is a great option for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it does nothing to fix the European question. What are you going to sell there? It's probably the most important market for that model, and now you can't sell it there. Okay, well, that's a problem and it's not solved by this solution, but at least you can still keep selling it in the US. But I think that you're not solving the other problems we talked about. It's still deficient on specs compared to its competitors. It doesn't have as much power as the Scout. It doesn't ride as nice as the Scout. It's still got the 5-speed transmission that's holding it back. And as much as we all love the air-cooled Sporty, I think we kind of have rose-tinted glasses with it. It's not that great of a highway bike. And in this day and age, we're pretty much all spending some time on freeways, at least in much of the main motorcycle markets of Harley Davidson, like in California, for example. There are very few people who spend no time on the highway. And as soon as you spend any time on the highway on one of those 5-speed bikes with the 1.2 or 1.6 inches of suspension travel, you immediately want a street bob. That's why they get traded in so frequently. People outgrow them and they realize they're just not great highway bikes. So the idea of just keeping it like the Gixxer 600 in production because you might as well, like I said, it doesn't fix the problems that killed the Sportster in the first place. It doesn't get you past European emissions, and it doesn't make you more competitive with the other bikes that are in the space that are starting to take your lunch. Okay, so what's the third option? Well, the third option is ultimately what Harley did, right? You build a new liquid-cooled modular platform that lets you enter a variety of markets. So you can go after the adventure touring segment with the Pan Am, but you can also build the 975 Nightster, and you can build a 120 horsepower Sportster S, and it gets you past European emissions. It gets you competitive with the other bikes in the space. If you're going really modern and high tech, well, you can get away with using a little bit more plastic, and you can get away with a slightly more radical design that gets the reviewers super happy and ecstatic with the bike. That also keeps the price down, right? Because sure, you're developing this really advanced motor, but you're going to be able to use it in the Pan Am and the Sportster S and a Bronx that you never end up building, and the Nightsters. The sky is the limit with that platform because the engine doesn't need a frame, right? You can basically bolt whatever subframe you want to it, whatever swing arm you want to it, whatever neck you want to it, whatever gas tank you want, and it'll do it, right? It can have 90 horsepower, it can have 150 horsepower, it can do basically whatever you want. And so you get to spread those R&D costs out over a really big pool of bikes that also offers a lot of different things for a lot of different riders. If you think about in contrast, if you develop a new air-cooled Sportster, it's pretty much just going to be useful for those models that you're replacing. It's going to be useful for a new 883 and a new 1200 and, maybe a new cafe racer or something like that, but it's not going to be useful for an adventure bike. It's not going to be useful for a naked sport bike. It's not going to be as able to spread its R&D over a really wide pool of buyers and over a wider set of price points too, because you can charge 20 grand for the Pan Am in a way that you probably wouldn't be able to charge $20,000 for some new air-cooled Sportster platform, because people would just buy a Softail at that point. So it gives you the ability to distinguish the motor as well from your already established product pool. On paper, this sounds like a really, really good idea, right? But why didn't it work? Well, I've alluded to it already, but it kind of comes down to the things we talked about at the beginning of the video, which is that the new bikes don't look and sound and feel like the old air-cooled Sporties. So people were going to need some time to get used to them. The same reasons that make the Revax competitive on specs and get past emissions are also the same reasons why people kind of walk past it. The motor isn't as pretty as the old air-cooled Evo Sporty is. It doesn't sound like that. It's not nearly as agricultural as the old air-cooled Sporty, which people like to think of as charm and personality. It's brand new, so it doesn't have the same aftermarket support, which means you can't really make the new Nightster into all of the things that you can make the old air-cooled Sporty into. So I think that's a big part of why it failed. I was editing during lunch and I realized that I wasn't as precise with my language as I would have wanted to have been here. I don't think that the bikes are failures in the sense that, like, obviously the Pan Am was the best-selling adventure bike in the United States for the first 2 years it was out, and obviously the new Revax bikes are great machines. But I do think that they were unsuccessful in very cleanly replacing the old air-cooled Sporties. But I also think that Harley was a little conservative with the bikes they chose to launch. The Pan Am being the most radical of the new bikes on the platform and probably the most critically acclaimed of the new bikes on the platform, I think provides a good example of the direction I think Harley should have gone in. Rather than build a niche bike like the Sportster S, I think they would have been a lot better off building something like the Bronx that had a wider appeal that could collect more of the market. I think they also made a mistake by not building what I would call like a super cool bike, right, that demands respect. The Nightsters, as good as they are as replacements for the aging air-cooled Evo Sporties, they don't really command a whole lot of respect on their own. Sure, they've got competitive specs, but they're not something that makes a Lowrider S customer stop and go, wait, what the heck is that? I look at something like the success on social media, at least, of something like the new Buell Super Cruiser with its Rotax-based engine and like 180 horsepower. It's got the inverted front suspension. It's got the look of what people often build for like hopped up Lowrider S's, but just with a lot more horsepower. And I wonder why Harley didn't build basically that when they saw how successful they were on social media with that bike. Harley could stick the Pan Am 150 horsepower Revax, inverted front suspension, big Brembos, an aluminum swing arm, and have a sub 500 pound, 150 horsepower cruiser with classic teardrop tanks that kind of scratches that performance niche in a way that guys who look at the Sportster S and go, it'd be cool if that motor was in a bagger, would actually want to buy. I don't know why the Sportster S looks how it looks. Like, it's not a bad looking bike, but it seems like the 10th bike you'd build with the Revax motor, not the second or first, like that doesn't make any sense to me, because why would you want this new mass market, broad appeal engine platform to only have a really niche bike on it other than your adventure touring bike, which is clearly designed to go after a new segment? So I think that if you pressed me on why the Revax option, the option that Harley ultimately went with, failed, I think it's a collection of things. One, the Nightsters launched at too high of a price, and now that they've come down in price, they're more successful, but they're still just not exactly what Harley customers are expecting, right? They're thinking of air-cooled potato, and they're getting almost Ducati-esque V-twin performance and feel. But I also think that Harley kind of did a weird dipping their toe and half measure stuff where they were afraid to bring out the Bronx, and so we got the Sportster S, a bike that I think honestly has more narrow appeal than something like the Bronx. And the bikes that they did come out with that were super, super successful, like the Pan Am, are just kind of seen as completely different and unaffiliated with the Nightsters. They're not the cool bike that's the lower spec of the other cool bike. They're just like a completely different machine. And so the respect that you got for the Pan Am didn't really transfer over to the Nightsters. But at the beginning of the video, I said I would ultimately, in hindsight, probably make the same mistake as Harley Davidson. And the reality is that when you think about it, you might too, because options 1 and 2 don't get better just because option 3 turned out to not be amazing, right? Like, it's still a bad idea to design a whole new air-cooled Sporty unless you can get it substantially cheaper than the new Softails. And I just don't really see how that's possible. And just continuing to build the air-cooled Sporty as a zombie model that doesn't really get a lot of updates, but just kind of exists. I mean, sure, if you pressed me, I'd say that's probably a better option than what they did, which was to just abandon the air-cooled Sporty completely and build the new Revax bikes. But I don't know how much better. We weren't selling a whole bunch of the air-cooled Sporty. I think the main thing you would accomplish by continuing to build it in that kind of zombie form is you would just basically shut up people on the internet. You would just kind of make that a comment that doesn't happen in comment sections anymore. And it's hard to justify a bike for that reason. But, you know, I wouldn't complain if there was an air-cooled Sporty for me to sell. Like, I don't think it's a problem. And the fact that the R&D is already done for it means, okay, whatever. It's not a problem. Like, I still think that that's probably the more correct answer in hindsight. But I can also see why Harley went with the third and final option, which was to just kind of say, hey, look, it had a good run, but we need something that's competitive on specs, that can get through European regulations, and that is less expensive to manufacture. And that means we're going to build a modular liquid-cooled V-twin. And that's what we did. We got the Revmax. And I think the Revmax is a great platform, but I think until Harley starts to expand it a little bit and really show people what the platform is capable of beyond the Sportster S and the Pan Am and the Nightsters, I think it's going to be kind of a side project for a lot of people. And it's going to be something that is just on the floor of the dealership, but they're still going to gravitate to the Softails and the baggers. And that's upsetting because I think there's a lot of potential there. And I really hope that the motor company comes out with something like the Super Cruiser, because I think that that could generate a lot of buzz around the engine platform, and it could really help to legitimize the other models that use that engine. And I'd also love to see something like the Bronx, although I think that something like the Super Cruiser would do even better while also scratching that itch. I hope you enjoyed this probably, I don't know, 40, 45, who knows how long this video is going to be. Video of a model that was killed years ago that probably most of you don't spend very much time thinking about, but that I do. Thanks for tuning in. If you stuck around this long, awesome, thank you. I don't know why you did, because this was just the ramblings of a crazy man talking about a motorcycle that isn't made anymore. So yeah, anyways, hope you enjoyed it.